welcome to the webinar this morning. As many of you know, we're doing a series of webinars to help people to hear more information about the different indicators in the Global Biodiversity Framework monitoring framework. And so today we're going to be talking about the indicators related to invasive alien species. And with us on the call, we have the expert from the Secretariat on Invasive Alien Species, Marianella. We also have a global expert who has been very involved in the methodology that's behind the proposal from the tagline indicators. Melody and Katie is representing GeoBond, which has been also sort of shepherding the process around some of these indicators, particularly the ones that relate to the essential biodiversity variables. So I'll hand over to Marianella now.
Thank you, Jillian, and good morning and good day to everyone. Let me just start sharing my screen. 1 minute. All right, so I think this is ready to go. So the first presentation today, it's just brief information about Target 6, just to provide some context before the GeoBond colleagues runs you through the indicators. So let me just start by referring generally to the GBF, the Biodiversity Plan. As you know, the plan has a vision of living in harmony with nature by 2050. And to do that, it has 4 goals and 23 targets. And if you pay close attention to the targets here, they are divided in 3 groups. So some of the targets are meant to help us in reducing threats. Other targets are meant to help us in meeting people's needs. And the other ones presents tools and solutions to help us with the implementation of the framework and in addressing the challenges that we have. The framework also has cross-cutting considerations that parties should take into account when they implement a framework and take actions towards the targets. And importantly, we have implementation and support mechanisms, monitoring, reporting and review, and communication elements. So for hold on, I don't know why it's not. Okay, here. So for Target 6, as I mentioned, Target 6 is part of the group of targets that are meant to be reducing threats. And Target 6 is the target on invasive alien species. So if we pay close attention to the language of the target, it calls to eliminate, minimize, reduce, and or mitigate the impacts of invasive alien species. And it is telling us that we should do that by identifying and managing the pathways, by preventing the introduction and establishment of priority invasive alien species, by reducing the rate of introduction and establishment of other known or potential invasive alien species, and it tells us by 50% by 2030. And it also refers to eradicating or controlling invasive alien species, especially on priority sites. So that is a lot of information. So what we have done from the Secretariat is that we have tried to create these target quick guides that will help hopefully connect parties and stakeholders in understanding the targets. So if you go to the CBD website, you will be able to access the targets quick guides. You can go to Target 6 and you can have information on why is the target important, the explanation of the target and the different elements that are part of the target, links to other elements of the GBF. You have information on the indicators, guiding questions, and so on. So I just invite you to have a look at the quick guides that could be very helpful in understanding the targets. But for today, I just want to go briefly through some of the elements of the target. When we break it down, it sounds easier. So of course, this is a target about invasive alien species. And as you know, invasive alien species are alien species. That means species that are outside their natural ranges that threaten biological diversity and ecosystems integrity. So the target also refers to pathways and the importance of identifying and managing these pathways. So the pathways are the means by which the alien species are introduced to the new environments, and then major pathways will vary between countries, and they will need to be identified in order to be actually addressed or managed. Then another element from the target is preventing the introduction and establishment. And then preventing the introduction of an invasive alien species is way more cost effective than eradicating the species once it has been become established. So to do that, we can actually use different methods. We can use, risk analysis, enhancing border control and quarantine measures, early warning mechanisms, rapid response measures, and management plans, among many others. Then the other two elements that I want to mention of the target, one very important one is prioritization. And this is important because we have limited resources and time to, by 2030 to address these targets. So parties will have to prioritize the pathways, they will have to prioritize the sites and the invasive alien species they wish to address. So prioritization is key for target 6. And then also we have eradicating or controlling, and then countries will need to determine management actions, and whether an invasive alien species is going to be eradicated or controlled will depend on a number of factors, and that decision will be done on a case-by-case basis by the countries. So these are the elements pretty much of the target 6. So now let me very briefly discuss why is the target important. And this information is coming from the IPES assessment report on invasive alien species and their control. So they mentioned that more than 37,000 alien species are established worldwide, and that 3,500 are invasive alien species that have been recorded. They also give us a number that approximately 423 billion is the estimated annual cost of dealing with biological invasions, and that was the data from 2019. And 92% is the proportion of the economic cost that it's related to invasive alien species that are actually damaging nature's contribution to people and the good quality of life. So as you can see, this is not a minor problem. This is something that calls for urgent action towards addressing, the issues and the problematic with invasive alien species. But we also need to understand how invasive alien species are actually impacting us. And pretty much they are one of the main direct drivers of biodiversity loss, and they affect biodiversity by competing with native species for resources, by direct predation, or by introducing pathogens. They also modify the composition of ecosystem, and therefore they affect the services that we receive from the ecosystems. They pose a threat to food security, to human health, and to the economies. And because we live in a globalized world where, international transport, trade, tourism are just increasing every day, the movement of species have been made easier and quicker. And then, that creates new pathways of introduction at a very quick speed. So that means that we really need to act now to address the target and to be able to have tangible results by 2030. So what is happening now then, it's that based on that, with the understanding that invasive alien species are one of the main drivers of biodiversity loss, they made it, of course, to the biodiversity plan. They are reflected in Target 6. And what we're doing now, it's that now that the framework has been adopted, then the countries are establishing national targets. They are updating and revising their national biodiversity strategies and action plans. And then that hopefully will translate into policies and actions on the ground. And then, as I mentioned before, it's very important to keep track of what we're doing and to know if we are on the right track and path. And therefore, there will be report to COP, there are monitoring and progress elements, as well as review elements considered in the framework. So you will be hearing more about that soon from the next presentations. So I'm going to conclude with this just by saying that action is required now if we want to actually achieve something by 2030, that it's very important that we follow the whole of government and whole of society approach as it is promoted by the framework. And I just want to share some useful resources. You can access the target quick guides that I mentioned here. You can see the decisions from the GBF, the Global Biodiversity Outlook 5 and other resources through these linkages. So this is my brief introduction. Hopefully it has provided some context for the next presentation. And with that, I will just thank you for your time.
Thanks, Nanelle. Thank you, Jillian, and especially to the Secretariat for organizing these webinars. They've been extremely informative, so I hope that a lot of people are getting information out of these. My name is Katie Millett. I am the Executive Secretary of GeoBon. GeoBon is a global network of voluntary researchers and experts dedicated to improving the acquisition, coordination, and delivery of biodiversity information at the national, regional, and global levels. Our mission is to inform people and policy on the status of changing biodiversity trends and patterns. A number of our members have been very active, providing information, guidance, and support, as well as the development of a lot of biodiversity indicators that are in the monitoring framework. And today, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on the rate of invasive alien species establishment for Target 6 for the GBF. Our speaker today is Melody McGeoch. Melody is joining us very late right now. She's in Melbourne, Australia. So thank you, Melody, for taking the time. Melody is a professor in ecology at Monash in Melbourne, Australia. Her research focuses on the ecology and conservation of species populations and communities, particularly quantifying and modeling the abundances and distribution of species to global change and biological invasions. Melody is also the co-chair of our species population working group at GeoBon. She was a coordinating lead author on the IPBES assessment on invasive alien species and their control. So she has a lot of information and background to provide for you on invasive species. And today she's going to tell you about recent developments and methodologies in this indicator. So Melody, please go ahead.
Thank you, Gillian, Marianella, and Katie. And I'd like to start today by thanking the many people who've contributed to this work over several years, and in particular to mention the Species Population Working Group of GeoBon, as Katie mentioned, but also the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, the IUCN SSC ISSG, the Invasive Species Specialist Group, and our STWIST Working Group, which is Theory and Workflows for Alien and Invasive Species Tracking, that was funded through IDIV, that has supported much of the work that I'll talk to you about today. So I'm really pleased that we're able to spend some time with you today presenting this work on, particularly on this headline indicator of target 6.1. If you could move forward, next slide, Katie. So as Marianella introduced, target 6 is to reduce the introduction of invasive alien species by 50% and to minimize their impact. And under that, there's some additional text that explains that headline indicator, or explains the target. And then the particular headline indicator that has been selected is the rate of invasive alien species establishment. So I'd like to start by making the point that when one looks at the target and when one reads the explanatory text underneath the target, it becomes immediately clear that that one single indicator is not going to be adequate to address the multiple dimensions of this target. So in the green text there, we have an element of the target that has to do with impacts of invasive alien species. We have one that has to do with preventing the introduction and establishment of priority invasive alien species. We have one that has to do with reducing the rates of introduction and establishment, and one to do with eradicating or controlling them, especially in priority sites such as islands. So a comprehensive suite of information to address this target cannot be covered by a single indicator. Nonetheless, the headline indicator that has been selected, 6.1, the rate of invasive alien species establishment, is justifiably the most important indicator of invasive alien species. So if we go a slide further, please. And the reason for this is really supported by the IPBES assessment that emerged last year. Marianella also mentioned this. And the IPBES assessment included an enormous amount of information, but some of its key messages and key statistics included, for example, that there's an estimated 200 new alien species establishing somewhere in the world every year. And one of the key messages was that prevention is most definitely the most cost-effective approach to dealing with invasive alien species. So the headline indicator about reducing the rate of new establishments is very closely related to the idea of prevention. The lower the rate of introduction, the slower the rate of introduction, the more likely we are to be successful in our, or the more likely we are to being successful in our prevention efforts. So I think there's good reason for having this as a headline indicator, but again, acknowledging that there may well be the need for additional indicators, and I'll say a little more about that later. Next slide. Now, jumping into the specifics of the rate of invasive alien species establishment, and just to step back for one moment, what I'll do in this presentation is explain how what the rate of invasive alien species establishment is. I'll then have a look at some of the challenges to producing such an indicator. I'll then talk about some of the solutions and the data needed to express this particular indicator. I will also say upfront that the work we've been doing and the work I'll present here has been explicitly designed so that the indicator can be produced at national scales and at regional scales. So we're not talking here today about estimating invasion trends globally, but rather what is needed to do this, in particular within and for countries. So if we look at the figure on the left, we have the year on the x-axis, and we have the cumulative numbers of invasive alien species on the y-axis. And we know that as you count up the new established invasive alien species or the new arriving invasive alien species over time, this curve will go up. Unless there's a substantial number of eradications, the curve is not going to flatten off or decline. So this is a very intuitive way of understanding whether the problem of invasive alien species is getting better or worse. So for example, if this top curve over here suggests that more species are coming in to a particular country every year than either of the two lines at the bottom. But what the shape of these lines at the bottom tell us is, for example, that in this part of the curve over this time period, it looks as though there's an exponential increase in the rate of introduction. So the rates are actually going up. Whereas over here, it appears that the rate is actually slowing. So it's superficially, I guess, pretty straightforward to produce a figure like this. All you need is information on dates of introduction and the accumulated numbers of those species then coming in every year. The challenge with, and if one thinks about it like that, is also quite intuitive to interpret, and it is meaningful. Because if we have these data, we can start to say something about whether we are managing to bend the curve, if you like, of invasive alien species establishments or introductions. The challenge with this is that while plotting and quantifying rates of invasive alien species establishment in this way is perfectly valid, because the data underpinning this indicator is not perfect, the curves that one finds on a graph like this are very misleading. And this is one of the key and very important points to convey about this particular indicator. So it's a very valid indicator with a solid rationale. It's intuitive to interpret and reasonably straightforward to produce superficially, but we have to understand the underlying data, and we have to apply certain modeling solutions, for example, to that underlying data to make sure that when we see curves like this on a graph showing changes in numbers of invasive alien species over time, we actually are seeing curves that we can interpret in a valid way. So I'll explain that. So it's very simply speaking, the number of observed new invasive alien species per year is not the true number of new invasive alien species. I'm sure that most people attending will appreciate the fact that the data that we have on invasive alien species suffers from delays in detection. So we don't always detect an invasive alien species in the year that it arrives. We often detect it many years later. We know that our effort to detect or observe new alien and invasive alien species is very uneven over time in most cases. And we know that there are often delays in publishing the data and or collating data that could be used for this purpose. So for all of those reasons, in fact, all of those sort of data shortcomings have significant implications for producing an indicator like this. Next slide. So this is a little bit of a technical deep dive slide, and I won't spend too long on it. But to further illustrate the point that I've just made and the sensitivity of these curves to data quality, I want you to look at the slide on the figure on the left. So in black, we have the real, perfect, in an imaginary world where we can know exactly how many invasive alien species are coming in a year. So in this case, we have 20 coming in every year until about year number 75, where the number coming in dropped to, say, around just above 10. In the dotted lines in various colors, we have over that time different scenarios for the types of survey effort. So in blue, we had no survey effort in the first couple of years. There was a sharp peak in survey effort, and then it declined over time. In green, survey effort increased until just before year 75 and declined. So if we were to now model or plot these data, as I explained, where we plot the change in numbers of alien species over time, in black we have the true curve, but depending on, and we don't actually know this true curve, so it's just, we have to deal with the dotted lines, but for illustration's sake here, we're showing the actual rate of introductions, which is in the black line, or actually the actual cumulative numbers of introductions in the black line, and the various introductions based on different survey scenarios. So what that shows is that even though these different scenarios are very different patterns of survey effort, with a very clear absolute and true numbers of introductions, we get three estimated curves that look very, very similar and quite different to the black line, which is the real curve. So early in time, if we didn't know the true rate and we were estimating it based simply on our imperfect survey effort, there are points in time where we would think that perhaps the introduction rate is exponentially increasing. There are points in time where we would think it was higher versus lower. But in reality, the black line represents the actual cumulative numbers of IAS. So you can see how survey efforts and changes in survey effort over time can produce rates of introduction, and that are quite different from what they should be. Next slide. Now, that might seem, it is quite complicated analytically speaking, but there are some straightforward solutions. And I think that's one of the key messages of the webinar from my perspective today. And that is, this is a solvable challenge. And there are two main ways in which one can solve this challenge. One is a data solution alongside an interpretive estimation of the introduction rate. And the data and the solution number two is more of an analytical solution. which involves model-corrected estimation of introduction rates. So I'm going to go through each of these in the following 2 slides. Next slide. So here we have solution number 1, which is an interpretive estimation of introduction rate. In the figure over here, in the red lines, we have the number of new species observations over time. And so in the top row, we have the numbers of observations over time declining. They're pretty stable in the middle row, and they're increasing in the lower row. In green, we have changes in different patterns of survey effort. So decreasing survey effort, stable survey effort, increasing survey effort. So there are only 9 possible ways in which you can observed numbers of new introductions and survey effort combine. And so by examining the relationship between changes in survey effort and changes in the numbers of invasive species observed, one can make some conclusions about the introduction rates in a particular country. So for example, if we have a scenario in number 1 here, where you have declining number of new species observations over time, but at the same time we have decreasing survey effort. That scenario is interpreted on the right here as an increasing risk of underestimating new invasive alien species introductions in that country. And that would compare, for example, with scenario number 9, where we have increasing survey effort and increasing numbers of species observations, which one might interpret as the need to maintain survey effort and increasing prevention efforts in order to reduce invasive alien species introductions. If we have, for example, increasing survey effort and decreasing numbers of new observations, that is interpreted as evidence for an increasing certainty in successful prevention or management of invasive alien species in a country. So any particular country could take information on the number of observed new introductions or establishments over time, alongside information on survey effort, and having a look at how the trends in these 2 things change over time, make some interpretive conclusions about the state of likely introduction rates in a country. Next slide. The second solution is a more analytical solution, and this is where one uses data on how many new introductions there are per year, and you model it using a range of possible models that in one way or another make some assumptions about survey effort, or actually use real survey effort data to correct the trend, so that one is more confident in the slope and therefore is more confident in the estimate of the rate of introduction. So here's a worked example where we have actual data on the world's invasive alien plant species, and we have cumulative numbers of invasive alien species over time from 1800, and we have the observed in the dashed line and the model fit in the black line. So this shows that the particular model we used here, which is something called the Solo and Costello model, which has an inbuilt assumption about survey effort, and it fits pretty well. However, if you use this model and then plot the outcome of the model instead of as cumulative number of IAS, but as invasive alien species per year, which is the rate, in the top line over here with the gray bars, we have the estimated introduction rate, and the dotted we have the observed rate. So the first thing you can see, the point I made earlier, if you don't, well, the first thing you can see is that the raw data, the observation rate, if you like, the naive model, is very different from the model corrected rate of introduction. So the B1 value is the introduction rate, and you can see that it is much higher for the naive observed data than it is for the actual model data. So when you model this introduction rate, it actually shows that the rate of introduction is slower than one would conclude if one were not to correct for this problem of survey effort. On the right here, we've got using the same model now for invasive alien plant species in 3 example countries, Australia, the United Kingdom, and Germany, with 95% confidence intervals. And again, the B values tell you about the rate of introduction. The rate is positive for Australia. So this suggests that in Australia, the numbers of invasive alien species are certainly increasing over time. The rate is increasing, it's positive. The United Kingdom, the rate is negative. In Germany, the rate's also negative, but it's very low and shallow. So that's just some examples of how this particular model could be applied within countries, for example, to plants or to vertebrates, or to all invasive alien species. Next slide. So what data are then needed to calculate the indicator? Well, there are 3 pieces of data one needs. One first needs a checklist of invasive alien species in the country or region. One needs information on the observed or estimated year of introduction of each species. And one needs a measure of survey effort in each year. Now, the good news is that such data are broadly available, if not perfect, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. But before the next slide, I also want to make the point that through the IPBES assessment and through the work that we've been doing, we're really trying to support and develop tools to encourage countries to invest in data collection on invasive alien species, particularly these 3 variables. And as part of the rationale for encouraging the collection of these data, it is very clear that there are many information benefits from these data, not only simply the ability to produce an indicator. So, for example, if we go through the different data steps from 1, 2, 3, and 4, the first step in producing the indicator, which is to collate and collect data on the invasive alien species present in the country, that information can also be used for prioritizing invasive alien species and in regulation. So this also, so prioritization, as we heard earlier, is another element of target 6. Step 2 is to collate and collect data on the year of introduction or the year of first record. These data are also really important in risk assessments and for pathway management. So again, this type of information has a very high information value. Step 3 for the indicator is to collate and collect data on survey effort or some proxy of survey effort over time, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Data on survey effort is incredibly valuable for designing surveillance and for estimating control costs. So again, high information value for these sorts of data. And finally, step 4, interpret the introduction and survey effort trends together, as I showed you for method 1. In addition to using this as an indicator, these sorts of graphics can be used to assess management effectiveness and not only policy effectiveness. So the take-home message is these 3 variables or types of data on invasive alien species have broad and deep value for both policy and management. Next slide. So the data needed to calculate the indicator, these 3 types of data, as I've just mentioned, different countries, as I don't need to tell you, are at different stages in terms of preparedness of their data sets to produce these indicators. Some countries have pretty good data on all of these 3 I would say very few countries have good data on all three types of data needed. But many countries have really good checklist data, for example. Others don't. And so the good news is that even if one as a country does not have data in country, there are data sources that can be used to start to produce these indicators. So number one, a checklist of invasive alien species in the country or region. The Global Register of Introduced and Invasive Species provides country checklists and a country compendium that are fair data and openly accessible and readily accessible. In terms of the observed or estimated year of introduction of each species, we have the first record database, which is also open by Siebens et al. And you can refer to those two publications, which I have all the publications listed at the end of this presentation. And then the final piece of information, a measure of survey effort in each year. This is more troublesome and less readily available. Nonetheless, there are a range of possible proxies, and which proxy to choose is really going to depend on your country, what makes sense, what data you have available. But we're pretty convinced that there will be a solution. So some of the things used, for example, are hectares surveyed, numbers of inspections of high-risk establishment sites, volumes of cargo inspected, numbers of new biodiversity records per year. So using the total volume of biodiversity data collected, for example, information that could be obtained through GBIF, to as a proxy for understanding how likely one is to have detected a new invasive alien species. And then there's the proportion of cells with expected presences that have relevant observations, and that's a published method that is used in the Species Information Index, which would be perfectly appropriate to use as well. Next slide. When one's producing this indicator, some of the terminology can get a little confusing and a little tricky, as is often the case when dealing with invasive alien species. And our clear recommendation here is to not be bogged down by the terminology, to look at the data that one is using, the data that one has, and to use the terminology that best matches the meaning of the data that you actually have. And so what I have here, which goes alongside the main publication that I've been referring to all along in these slides, is a table that actually clarifies some of these concepts. For example, the difference between an introduced species versus an established species. So there's no need to get too bogged down about these concepts and definitions. The most important thing is to just be quite clear about what it is precisely you have in your data set. Next slide. Finally, I'm just briefly in one slide going to mention that in the last 2 weeks, a publication emerged which presents options for producing a range of indicators of the impacts of invasive alien species, and also indicators of the information adequacy of alien species data for particular countries. So I won't go into any of the detail here, but just refer you to this publication if you're interested in producing indicators of impact. Next slide. So listed on this slide is the range of publications that I've referred to in the presentation to date. And I might hand over to Katie.
Thanks, Nadi. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about the relevance of this information to the newly published ATEG documents ahead of SBSTA. So the first thing that you might be aware of in the Annex 3 of SBSTA document 26/2, it talks about some of the gaps in this indicator. So this is on page 28 of that document. And just pulling out that text, so two of the major gaps that were identified for the headline indicator on invasive species is that it doesn't currently address the impacts of invasive species. So as Melody was saying, there's lots of ways. There's no one particular indicator that's important or that captures it all. So what's missing is that the impact of invasive alien species on ecosystem services. And it also doesn't capture the eradication and control of invasive species on priority sites like islands. So maybe, Melody, can you speak to this indicator then?
Sure. Thanks, Katie. So in terms of impacts, for example, that gap could potentially be filled using the methods I referred to in the previous paper. But the paper I'm referring to in this slide did a review of all available indicators using the pressure state or driver pressure state response type of framework. And as you can see, there are many published indicators on invasive alien species. And one can have a look at some of these, but each of them was evaluated according to a range of criteria as to whether, the indicator is representative, sensitive, spatially representative, temporally representative, etc. But I think the main point is that there are alternatives. This paper summarizes what they are and looks at the strengths and weaknesses of each of them. And it includes, for example, one of the oldest indicators of invasive alien species, which perhaps addresses that second gap, which has to do with eradications at priority sites. So one of the previous indicators used was vertebrate eradications on islands. That is an existing indicator. The methodology is well developed. I don't know that it's actually been updated, but it is certainly something that countries could adopt and use. Can't hear you, Katie.
Sorry about that. So in addition to document 26/2, there is this advice from the AUTEG document, which is 2/add.1. And so this is what the AUTEG, which is the group of experts, recommended. And so here are some of the text there. So one of the recommendations from the group was to remove the term significantly from the indicator text because it doesn't it does not impact the interpretation of the text, nor its associated questions, and avoids ambiguous language. The indicator focuses on the number of countries implementing measures and allocating resources, not the outcome of these measures. The inclusion of the word significantly at the end of the sentence raises the issue of their effectiveness, which is not directly relevant and induces ambiguity. So that is potentially some advice that might be considered at Substone. So another point on this indicator is that current questions do not touch upon the allocating of resources mentioned in the indicator. The expert group recommends adding a third question asking about whether resources have been allocated to reduce the impact of invasive alien species. So for example, has your country allocated the resources to reduce the impact of alien invasive species? Another recommendation was this question could have a simple yes/no answer reflecting whether parties have allocated resources, financial and/or human, for the invasive species impact reduction. Alternatively, the mention of allocating resources could be removed from the indicator text. And lastly, select all that apply. So this is very technical, but in the text that also could be removed or it's not relevant. And now I'll just hand back to Melody to speak to the IPBES Chapter 6.
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, so just looking at the SEPSTA document that refers to resourcing, I just wanted to draw everyone's attention to the IPBES assessment and parts of Chapter 6, particularly the two figures shown here. So there are parts of Chapter 6 that talk about invasive alien species indicators and provide some advice and recommendations and options, if you like, rather than recommendations. And these two figures were used from previous indicators in previous CBD reporting rounds. and I think also for the Sustainable Development Goal indicators. And they use sort of information that emerged from a survey of countries about whether they had funding for invasive alien species management or not, and if they had funding, what type of funding. So I thought I would just draw attention to this because it appears to relate to this discussion about resourcing.
And so that's the end of our presentations and the end of our slides. I know that this is being recorded by the secretary and they will be posted again. So if you want to rewatch this, or if you're interested in any of the papers or that reference slide that we shared, you can look up those papers. I see there's one question in the chat, but I also welcome to you if you have any questions you want to ask in person, just to raise your hand. So Melody, there's one question, if you can. This is from Daniel. So how would you go from measuring the rate of introductions to measuring the rate of establishments, which is another challenge? Is there?
That's a very good question. Thank you, Daniel. It relates partly to the slide I showed with the table of definitions of concepts. And this is precisely where I feel we don't want to get too bogged down into the specifics. So I would divide my answer into two parts. One is about the data, and the other is about the method of using those data in an indicator. So first of all, the data. Introduction information or introduction data tends to come from interception records at ports and that sorts of things. And some countries have data like that, like New Zealand, that's readily available. Other countries don't. And so most data on that is available to be used for estimating rates comes from actual established data, established species data. So numbers of new invasive alien species in a country is usually, in reality, numbers of new established invasive alien species in a country, or numbers of new established alien species in a country. So that's about the data. And so I would imagine, and that's why the word establishment is used in the indicator and not introduction in the indicator, but it's making quite a fine point of things. And I think one just needs to be, one would do one or the other. If you have data on both, fantastic. You could then use precisely the same method to produce both an indicator of rates of introduction and an indicator of rates of establishment.
I hope that answers your question, Daniel. Now I see James, the coach at OTEG, has his hands up. James, do you want to take the floor? You might need speaker.
Thank you. Lisa's doing her magic in the background. Thank you very much indeed. Firstly, thank you very much indeed for the presentation. It's been very helpful. This has been one of the ones I wasn't quite sure how it was going to work. So actually really pleased to hear the details. So thank you very much indeed for that, Melody. My comment was part comment, partly question. I think what Daniel was just saying in terms of establishment, I was wondering much the same in terms of first introduction versus establishment, because I mean, certainly the figures that we've got for the UK, and I was very interested to see that graph. We reckon in the UK indicator that we've got something around 3,343 non-native species, of which 2,074 have become established and 195 are being impactful, and that's what we're actually measuring the impact on. And I think that there is a key question here in terms of whether you've actually got something or whether it's actually causing a problem. And I think that we may, this is where multiple measures may perhaps be useful. But I wanted to pick up on a little bit of a detail here about repeated invasion and eradication. And just as an example, we've had Asian hornets coming into the UK. There's very much an alert for them because of beekeepers, and where they've been found, they've been eradicated. And that's happened several years in a row. And and just intrigued to know how you feel that would be dealt with within the indicator that you're proposing here, because in some ways it's in and out and in and out.
Yes, and well, thank you for those comments. And in a case like the UK, where you have clear data on all three of those stages of introduction, you could use exactly the same method on those subsets of data, and that would be very valuable. Perhaps one point I didn't make sufficiently clear in the presentation is the data that we were working on with, which again is defined in the table, is invasive alien species data, where invasive alien species data is defined as a species present in a country that has recorded evidence of impact either in that country or anywhere in the world.
Okay, thank you.
You might decide to define yours differently, and that's fine, but I think your point about, we really are interested in those species that have an impact. And so it is, yes, it's important to try to look at that subset when one's looking at the rates, if possible. In terms of the second, again, it's about the data versus the method of producing the indicator. And if your data are good enough that you can, with reasonably, you can update the data set reasonably frequently so that you can record arrivals, establishments, eradications, re-arrivals, establishments, eradications. You simply add and remove that species from the data set for the particular period of calculation. So we worked with, if I recall correctly, sort of 5-year periods from 1970 onwards for the global data. If you have data annually that you feel is good enough to calculate the data, to calculate the indicator annually, fantastic. But there's nothing standing in the way of actually capturing eradications in that data set. So you will just have fewer species in year 2 than in year 1 because one or more have been eradicated by year 2, and they may then re-arrive in year 3.
That's fair. Thank you very much.
Are there any other questions? I see nothing in the chat. I have one actually, Melody. In calculating this, is it possible to disaggregate the data by introduction and establishment pathways? Do you think that's the best way that countries maybe be able to prioritize their efforts if there's an important pathway in maybe an island state that would have a better impact? Yeah.
So absolutely. So if one has the data, then you could calculate the very same indicator with the very same method, but divide the data set by pathway of introduction. So you could look at rates of new invasive alien species establishments for species coming in through the fresh produce and cut flower industry, for example, or through species coming in through airports. Absolutely.
And something that has an impact on a particular site or something in that sense of value. Yeah. So I see some more questions coming in. So this one is from Gregory. He says, standardizing search effort is especially challenging for several habitats and taxonomic groups, including in coastal marine systems, yet this is a core component. How do we address this? So standardizing efforts across habitats.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. So again, it's about deciding, assuming this is expressing the indicator nationally, unfortunately, one has to some extent to gloss over the fine scale variation. And the only way to do that is to use a somewhat more distal proxy of survey efforts, such as the one I mentioned in the slide, whose name I now temporarily forget, where you could use, for example, new biodiversity records per grid cell per year as a proxy, because, you know, based on the assumption that the better surveyed a particular area is in a particular, over a particular time period, the more likely you are to detect a new alien or invasive alien species in that area. You know, so for here, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's survey effort for plants versus birds versus, you know, none of that's been sort of sorted, and I'm not sure we'll be able to ever achieve that granularity in and integrate it into these sorts of indicators at a national scale.
Mm-hmm. So in the last minute, maybe I'll hand it over to, I've seen just a comment from Tiffany, but no other questions. So maybe I'll hand it over to the Secretariat for any closing comments.
I think I'll just thank everyone for joining today. It's been really interesting to hear some of the specific details on this indicator and this issue of survey effort. I think it probably definitely applies to a number of the indicators, and so this is a good example of looking at exactly what the survey effort does to a specific indicator on species. On this, I will wish everyone a good day, and if anyone is interested, the webinar that we're having tomorrow will be on the finance indicators, and so feel free to join us tomorrow. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.